Hey guys, this is Nirpam with the Underwater Photography Guide and Blue Water Photo. I'm actually here today in the office at Blue Water Photo. I've just been diving with the new Canon RF 100mm macro lens over the weekend. I've had an awesome time exploring some shipwrecks, doing some rocky reefs offshore here in Southern California. The water is still cold, unfortunately, but there's lots of life to see: nudibranchs, gobies, blennies, really anything you could want in California. We got it and it's been awesome. So I thought I'd give you a quick review about what I thought about the lens, if you should upgrade if you have the original EF and not the RF 100mm macro, and show you some of my images and video. So without further ado, this here is the Canon RF 100mm macro lens. So let's start with the build quality. It's solid as any Canon lens is. I'm not a huge fan of the plasticky material that they use. It looks like it scratches easily, and it does seem to scratch easily. Often you can rub off the scratches, but I'm not a big fan of the material. That being said, it's well designed. It's got 3 controls that make it really easy to use. So let's go over some of the lens controls before I get into what I think about the quality. The first control is a focus limiter, so you can choose to basically have the lens focus in the full range. At full, you can go from 0.5 meters to infinity and 0.26 meters to 0.5 meters. Now, generally, I recommend leaving it in full because this is not something you can change once you have it in an underwater housing and you're diving with it. So the camera's really fast at focusing, the lens is really fast at focusing. Leave it in full and it'll have no problem in the full range of its focusing. Let's see. You have an autofocus, manual focus switch. I recommend leaving it in autofocus. And then you have a stabilizer switch. So I recommend leaving the optical image stabilization on, and you'll be able to get much more stable video and also shoot at slightly lower shutter speeds when you're shooting photos of moving subjects. So the first ring you have on this lens is a control ring. So if you want to set it to your aperture or shutter speed, you can do so. The second ring is a focus ring. If you want to do manual focus or autofocus, this will allow you to focus. And honestly, I really like the pull on it. If you do manual focus above water, it focuses pretty good in its range for just a little bit of movement. So I like that. And then finally, this last ring here is probably the most special thing about this lens. It's a spherical aberration control. Now what that means is you can actually control the quality of the bokeh on the lens, but I do have a warning for you. It doesn't really work well underwater or generally at all. And the reason for that is once you move past 0 in either direction, the image gets quite soft, and I have some sample photos that show that. So I was not impressed with the spherical aberration control. I had some really high hopes for it when I was reading about it when the lens came out, and those hopes were not met. I don't necessarily recommend using this. Now when I shot underwater, I kept it on 0. I wanted my images sharp, but you could always play around with it and it'll look a little bit hazy. I don't really know why you'd want to do that. But it's a fun thing if you're going to take some photos of people or something and you want to be a little bit artsy. So I'm going to talk about some of my favorite things about the RF 100. I think my most favorite thing is the autofocus. The autofocus is lightning quick. It's kind of crazy how quick it is. Like if you put it side by side with a Nikon or even a Sony macro lens, it's just the quickest by far out of any combination out there currently. What I was most impressed with was the fact that it can move from focusing up right next to the lens all the way to infinity in less than a second. I mean, it's amazing how quickly it just moves across the range, and I'm really happy about that. When it comes to autofocus tracking, I wouldn't say that the RF 100 is any more or less effective than the EF 100. The tracking system is very similar in both. On paper, the RF 100 should be quicker, and I think it could be. It's just I didn't notice the difference because they're both so quick that when it comes to tracking, I just felt they were both really accurate, both very quick, and I didn't notice the difference. Now, I did notice that on the EF lens, and it was probably the subjects I was shooting, the animal eye autofocus tracking acquired more, and that, again, I think is just the subjects and not the lens. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the image quality from the Canon RF 100mm macro. This here is one of my favorite photos that I've taken with the lens. You can see the details are fantastic. It's on par with the EF 100 millimeter. I wouldn't say it's necessarily any better though, so that's something to keep in mind. But for a 100 millimeter lens, I mean, the quality is excellent. I think it's a better lens than the Sony 90 and just as good as the Nikon 105. So as far as a macro lens goes, it's one of my favorite for image quality. One thing I should mention though, I did notice some diffraction and a little bit of noise in some of my shots that I wouldn't have expected with the original EF 100 millimeter macro. So this photo, I actually had to reduce some of the noise that was in some of the shadows here, and I wouldn't have expected that normally. I don't know if that's a product of the lens or how I was shooting, but to me, it felt like the lens at higher f-stops had a little bit of diffraction. But so this next image here shows one of my favorite properties of the lens, which is that it's a 1.4 times macro lens, which means you can zoom a lot more than you could with a normal 1:1 macro. And I wouldn't say it's a ton more, but it's almost like a very low power diopter on your camera. And so for subjects like Ubin and Gobi, which was maybe only a half an inch in length, you can get really close, and you can even see the teeth in this photo of this little Gobi. So I think that's a really cool shot. Now you'll notice, and I did notice this, the closer you get, you do get a slight degradation of image quality when you are at that 1.4 magnification. This was as close as I could get. So this is that 1.4 to 1 ratio. This is just a nice photo that I took of a Spanish shawl. I think it shows a little bit of that, how nice the bokeh is in the background, and the details on the nudibranch themselves are pretty good. Now, the photo is a tad bit noisy, and that's kind of what I was getting at when I was saying this lens is a little bit noisy, because I'm at ISO 200. I wouldn't expect the photo to be as noisy as it did turn out, especially if you look at the grain of the bokeh. So that's one thing that I noticed. It's easy to take out in post-processing, but it's something to think about. I really like this photo that I captured with the lens. Now, the reason I was able to capture this is because the autofocus speed is so quick that if you witness something like a frogfish opening its mouth, it can get that. So I was pretty happy with it. And yeah, this next one really shows how good the details are. I stacked a Kraken plus 13 diopter on the lens, so you can see just how sharp you can get when you have a diopter. This is definitely a super macro subject. It's a brown cheek bunny. Again, it's probably only about an inch for this head, maybe less, maybe about half an inch for the head of this fish. And you're getting fantastic details. You're seeing the chromophores on the skin. So I'm really happy with it. And I took this photo to show a little bit of the effect of the bokeh. It's not my favorite photo, but you can see this nudibranch has these cool little yellow spots. And you can see the shape and color of the bokeh and how it came out in the photo. And I'm pretty happy with that. I think it's pretty decent bokeh. It's a little bit soft. It's not super hard. And again, with this lens, you can adjust the shape of the bokeh, but I highly don't recommend it underwater because it makes your images softer. This is another example of how quick the autofocus is with the RF100. I'd only be able to take this shot with a lens that focuses that quick because this fish is a signal bunny, and that dorsal fin is only up for a couple fractions of a second, and it's very hard to get the eye in focus as I did when this fish is jumping up and moving its dorsal around. So it's a pretty impressive shot from a pretty impressive lens. This just goes to show you what happens when the lens is open. Again, at a wide aperture, shallow depth of field, you can see it's razor thin. Let's see what my f-stop was. 6.3, and it's still pretty razor thin. Again, I did have a diopter on this, but I just wanted to show the quality of the bokeh and the transition between the sharp parts of the image and the softer parts. Now, those are some of my photos that I wanted to show you guys, and let's get back to the video. So overall, I think that if you have the Canon EF 100mm macro and you're shooting it underwater and you have the EF to EOS R mount adapter, I don't necessarily think that you need to upgrade to the RF 100. If you want the quickest autofocus speed possible, then yeah, sure, go ahead, upgrade, and it'll be a little bit better. You might not notice it a whole lot, but it'll be marginally better, and it'll be, the best you can really get for a macro lens. Especially if you're planning on, really transitioning from shooting infinity to way up close to the lens, just like that. I recommend the RF because it has better autofocus speed. That being said, overall, I would say that the image quality for both lenses is very similar, but I like both of them. I mean, it was hard for me to really discern many differences. They both have a similar range of apertures. They can both do 2.8 at their widest, and they both have really nice bokeh. So overall, I mean, this lens is insanely sharp, and it's a very nice lens. If you have a Canon R5 or a Canon R6 and you're thinking about getting a macro lens, definitely go with the RF 100mm. I do wish it didn't have the spherical aberration control, because then it would have probably been cheaper. But if you have an R camera, go for the R lens. Otherwise, if you're already shooting an EF lens, maybe consider and weigh your options. If you can sell that EF lens, then I would recommend buying the RF lens. Otherwise, just go ahead and keep shooting your EF lens, and I'm sure you'll be happy. Now, with the Ikelite housing, the RF lens does take the same port system as the EF lens with the mount adapter. I don't know if that's the same across the board, and of course we're going to check. But if you guys have any questions at all about using the Canon RF 100mm macro, the port system that you need to use it, what our thoughts were, if you want to see more sample photos and video, feel free to reach out to us. Drop a comment in the comments below. Check out the links in the description for our full review. And if you like this video, make sure you like and subscribe. With that, I hope you have some awesome dives shooting the RF 100mm macro if you get the chance. It's an awesome lens, and I can't wait to see the results that come from this lens.